Hey everybody, it's Ann Beebe. Today is Monday, March 4th, 2020. I'm Barb Hammer. So today I want to do a follow-up to my video about George Orwell and 1984 and rethinking George Orwell. So this is more in response to that video. I put in my videos to kind of start a dialogue, and I know I wasn't very clear about my objections to George Orwell or his writings. So anyway, this is to kind of clarify things a little bit, clear up some things. So I did post in the comments of the previous video some clarifications and corrections. So anyway, this is more a reconsidering Orwell, his list, his blacklist or whatever, and specifically 1984, his novel 1984. So anyway, this is all in conjunction with how China and other governments are being smeared for mass surveillance or controlling their populations in conjunction with the current coronavirus crisis. Never let a good crisis go to waste. Anyway, I want to clarify some things about George Orwell. So some people have sort of questioned what I said about George Orwell. So I will let people pass judgment for themselves on George Orwell. I'm going to kind of talk about, I could have easily done like a video that was an hour and a half long about George Orwell and his writing. But anyway, I want to clarify some things. I realized I wasn't very clear, so I'm going to use, let's say, my husband always talks about his 3 points, the 3 points that he would use in lessons he would deliver in class at community college. So he taught university level courses, but he always jokes about his 3 points that he would use in a lesson. So I'm going to use his 3-point format. I'm going to try to do this more, not always, maybe, I don't know. So I got 3 points. Let's say George Orwell's life, his the class that he grew up in, and his experiences. That's one point. The list that he made, his notebook, and the list that he passed along that he knew was going to the British Foreign Office, the circumstances of that, and the consequences, let's say. Okay, that's point number 2. Point number 3, the novel 1984, in conjunction with what was going on at the time, the Cold War, and totalitarianism, the thinking about totalitarianism. So there was this mixing at the time, excuse me, of this conflation, perhaps, I don't know if I'm using that word correctly, of fascism with communism. So this is all in conjunction with smearing China, North Korea, other left governments, countries that have leftist governments. So anyway, building on that. So anyway, George Orwell. So his life, I will talk about his the context of his life. So at the time, so when he was born and raised, so he grew up. He described his situation as excuse me again. He describes his situation, and this is all from Wikipedia and other sources, as lower, get this, lower upper middle class. And I asked my husband about that, and my husband's taught sociology, and he said, oh yeah, unfortunately, you get into that in sociology. And so lower upper middle class is like, they want to stratify society so much, it gets a little bit ridiculous. So I I grew up middle class, but I don't know, maybe I could be classified as lower upper middle class. I don't know, because I came from, on my mother's side, sort of that sort of background where there were people who were upper class. My mother had an uncle who was the governor of West Virginia, but on my father's side, I was hillbilly. I don't know. That's kind of messed up. So he was solidly middle class, and his family made a point of getting him into Eton, which is one of those upper crust public schools, which is actually a private school in British society. Eton, yes. So they had aspirations for him. And then George Orwell, he went, because this was still the time of the British Empire, he went to work as a police officer in British colonial Burma, which is now Myanmar. So that was when he got into the habit of creating lists. And sometimes writers do that too. They will have lists. I will say, I know that. And I don't know, maybe I should have my own list. Anyway, so he got in this habit of drawing up lists, and he had a notebook of a list of people that he wasn't sure about, that were questionable, maybe were too far to the left, and maybe Soviet or communist sympathizer. Anyway, so Orwell, after that, so, because he was familiar with the British Empire, and he was an idealist. So later he actually went to Spain, and he fought for the Republican movement in Spain. And so as basically the fascists, Francisco Franco's fascists, or loyalists, I guess, because they were loyal to the monarchy, the Spanish monarchy, I don't know. And then against the Republican movement, which was a coalition of people on the left. And the only solid support that they got, the Republican movement, was from the Soviet Union at the time. So I would guess that the communists were in charge there. So there were leftist volunteers from Western countries, like George Orwell from the UK, who went there, and he went to Spain, and he fought for the Republican movement. And he was a sniper, from what I understand. So, and, Spanish Civil War was really not nice. No civil war, no revolution is going to be pleasant. It's a bloody massacre. It's not nice at all. So he went there as an idealist, and I'm sure that was a real wake-up call. So he was there for maybe 7 months, fighting and working on the front lines as a sniper. And he himself was shot by a sniper on the opposing side, I guess, in the neck. He was lucky he survived. He was lucky he wasn't killed. He was lucky that he was not permanently paralyzed. Yeah, shot through the neck. That's not nice. And he recovered, but also he was ideologically, he was an anarcho-syndicalist, anarchist. And that got him into trouble in Spain with the communists there. So he and his wife, they were actually forced to flee Spain because communists there were rounding up people like him because they were considered subversives. And anarcho-syndicalism, like, I'm not an ideologue, but anarcho-syndicalism is basically market. I know people aren't going to criticize me for my analysis. I'm used to this. So anarcho-syndicalism, it has to do with basically a market economy, but supporting unions within that context, and direct democracy, I guess. So because the Republican movement was trying to fight to establish um, a strong central government, sovereign government, um, people with Orwell's ideology, they were considered a threat because it was more, they didn't want, I think people like Orwell did not want a strong central government. I don't know. So anyway, he was considered a threat, his wife, and they had to flee. So that affected his views about communism, I'm sure. So he was definitely anti-fascist, but I'm sure that affected his views about communism. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. So Orwell's list. That's another thing. Um, um, I found. I was told about this very good article, and this article is this is an archived version. It still exists online, but this is archived in case it disappears. And this is about Orwell's list, which I touched upon in the other, or I talked about in the other video. This is from the New York Review of Books. So this is a mainstream media outlet. And this is a very long article, very good article. I read through this a couple of times, really. And it has 3 parts. And it talks about the circumstances of Orwell's list. So I have to say the circumstances were, which I didn't really get into in the other video. So he kept this notebook, George Orwell, Eric Blair is his real name. He kept this notebook that contained a list of people that he thought were either crypto-communists or fellow travelers, sympathizers, anyway. And he, his wife had died, and so he was very lonely. So he became acquainted with a young woman who was working for the Foreign Office's Information Research Department, which is basically an anti-communist propaganda office. And he was trying to impress her, and he offered to provide some names of people who would not be good for producing propaganda, anti-communist propaganda or anti-Soviet propaganda. This was the Cold War. So she was kind of stringing him along, and he was lonely, trying to impress her. So he gave her 38 names from his notebook, I think handwritten. So he passed that along to her. She gave them to the Foreign Office Information Research Department that she worked for. They typed them up, and this was a list that they use, referred to in conjunction with their propaganda work. So anyway, he knew that they were going to this Information Research Department in the British Foreign Office. He knew that. So anyway, he was lonely and desperate, I guess. So what were the consequences of that? It's hard to say. This came to light after this woman died, I guess. So came to light that there was this list. So the British government had to reveal the list, and they put it in the British National Archives for people to see. But it's unclear whether or not that list was passed along. And there's some things that I said in the previous video that were incorrect. So I will say it's hard to say if that list was passed along to maybe the FBI. I don't know. So some things that were incorrect, I stated that it was not used necessarily to stop. Did it go to the FBI? I don't know. Not necessarily used to prevent Charlie Chaplin from re-entering the U.S. they had already tried to prosecute him before on charges to deport him. So anyway, the McCarthyism was really bad in the U.S. So Charlie Chaplin, who's a British citizen, but he spent a lot of time in the U.S., he was forced not to return to the U.S. Eventually, he settled in Switzerland. Anyway, so he was on Orwell's list. And the funny thing is, Orwell wasn't sure if Charlie Chaplin was Jewish, so Orwell had certain bigoted attitudes that were not unique for the time. Other people were on his list. The interesting thing is that Michael Redgrave, the actor Michael Redgrave, who later appeared in the British production, 1956 production of George Orwell's 1984, he is one of the characters in that movie. He portrays O'Brien, I think, but he's called O'Connor because of Edwin O'Brien was in that movie. The American actors, anyway, they had to change the name of the character. Okay, so anyway, now I want to get into the novel itself, 1984. So I already talked about Animal Farm, and there is this ridiculous cartoon of Animal Farm, which is was intended to smear the Russian Revolution and Stalin. So this is based on Orwell's book from 1944, Animal Farm. And I would give the links to these because they're kind of, this cartoon turns out it was the CIA that funded this cartoon to smear the Soviet Union and the Russian Revolution. Anyway, yeah, so Orwell, his works were, okay. So anyway, 1984. The interesting thing is, I forgot to mention in the previous video, Orwell was the first one to use this term, the Cold War. Now, what is the Cold War? It's not a hot war, so it's not a war that is openly declared. It's not a full conflict, armies involved. It becomes just a constant situation of tension and constant military buildup. So it's interesting that he used this term Cold War in regard to the Soviet Union. In 1984, so some say that it's very anti-fascist, but the problem with 1984 is it kind of blurs the distinctions between fascism and communism, and kind of calls them all totalitarian systems. So right now, the problem with that is it's being used now. The novel 1984 is being used now to smear countries that have leftist governments, such as, in particular, China, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, where there was just a failed coup attempt, and Nicaragua, among others. Anyway, so this totalitarianism is kind of a vague term, and so 1984 is all about mass surveillance and controlling people. And it's very much, there's a blurring between fascism and communism. And I think that's the problem. It's not so much with Orwell. Orwell was just a creature of his times. But I have a problem with how 1984 is being used now, often by libertarians, to smear countries that have governments that are leftist. That's my real problem with 1984 and George Orwell. George Orwell, Eric Blair, he's dead. He's dead and gone. His literature continues, and a lot of libertarians are big fans of 1984. So anyway, in this article from, once again, this is the same article, very good article, I should read through it, Orwell's List from the New York Review of Books. And I will have to repeat again, this cartoon was funded by the CIA. And that's mentioned in this article. So it has like 3 points again. And it talks in the third part, towards the last. I have my handy dandy whiteboard. That's what I'm referring to here. So, about George Orwell himself and his list. So it says here, if the charge is that Orwell was a Cold Warrior, the answer is plainly yes. Orwell was a Cold Warrior. Even before the Cold War began, warning against the danger of Soviet totalitarianism in animal form when most people were still celebrating our heroic Soviet ally. The Soviet Union was a part of the Allied resistance against Nazi Germany. So anyway, he appears in the Oxford English Dictionary as the first writer ever to use the term Cold War in English. He had fought with a gun in his hand against fascism in Spain and was wounded by a bullet through his throat. He fought communism with his typewriter and hastened his death by exertion. Now, I'm not one myself to idealize leaders, but it's more about the systems that are in place. Okay, so was Orwell a secret police informer? And they say no. This is an article that's written, it's a mainstream media article, clearly siding with the Cold War against the Soviet Union at the time. But it's giving a good explanation of Orwell and his time. So it's kind of strange. Okay, and it also says here, in this paragraph, the list, Orwell's list, invites us to reflect again on the asymmetry of our attitudes toward Nazism, fascism, and communism. Orwell liked making lists. In a London letter to Partisan Review in 1942, he wrote, I think I could make out at least a preliminary list of the people who would go over to the Nazi side if the Germans occupied England. Suppose he had. Suppose his list of crypto-Nazis had gone to the political warfare executive. Would anyone be objecting? So anyway, it's kind of interesting that Orwell, he wrote 1984 about the manipulation of thought, whatever, censorship, whatever, mass surveillance, but he himself was complicit in this drawing up of lists of dissidents. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, I hope this kind of clarifies what I want to say about George Orwell and his list. And I will leave it to you to decide about Orwell and his list in 1984. But I guess the point I want to make is don't let 1984, if you are on the left, don't let 1984 be used to smear China, countries like China that have governments that are not neoliberalized like in the West. Don't let it be used to smear countries that have leftist governments like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. Don't let it be used to stereotype them. So leftist governments have mixed economies, even in Cuba. So Cuba and North Korea, they have more communist systems, but they're really mixed systems. They're a mixture of market economies with social programs to support the people. And people forget that even in the West, Now everything has become neoliberalized, privatized government. Before, the norm was Keynesianism. Keynesianism was about injecting stimulus into the economy, giving people money to spend in the economy. Now it's all about kleptocracy. So government funds are handed out in bailouts to corporations and the rich and the wealthy and powerful. But that wasn't the norm before Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the West. So Keynesianism, people have forgotten Keynesianism. So I guess, anyway, I hope this clarifies a little bit what I was trying to say in the previous video. I don't mean to smear George Orwell, Eric Blair. He was a product of his times, and he was anti-fascist, but he was, based on his experiences, he was concerned about Soviet Union and communism. Anyway, so I hope that explains George Orwell and his list a little bit better, I hope. And I'm sorry for the confusion, things that I stated incorrectly in the previous video. Anyway, 1984, it's very good. I often cite the term doublespeak in conjunction with neoliberal color revolutions because they will use the term nonviolent resistance. Nonviolent, meaning not peaceful, violent, but violent. Yes. So I'm going to give you a couple of links to, this is the 1956 movie of 1984. And it includes someone from George Orwell's list. This is Michael Redgrave. I will also include the link to this cartoon version of Animal Farm. And it actually ends differently from the novel itself. I remember. 1984 is readily available on Amazon, CIA Amazon. So I don't think it's generally taught in schools. I didn't read it in school. I read it later. I read Animal Farm. I'm not sure. I think I read Animal Farm on my own. I don't think it was for a class. I can't remember. Anyway, that's all I want to say. So I hope that clarifies things a little bit more. I will leave it to you to judge, but please don't let Orwell's 1984 be used for the big business agenda to smear leftist governments. Anyway, that's all I have to say for now. Thanks for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.